Hi, Sage here with Hippie from the 49th and the Hippie Sunday Bible Review. After the journey out of Egypt and the construction of the tabernacle, in the book of Exodus, the Israelites now stand at the beginning of a new chapter. Through Moses, God gives instructions on sacrifice, priesthood, purity, justice, and how the people are meant to live in relationship with the divine. Many of these laws may seem unfamiliar or repetitive to modern readers, but they reveal the beliefs, customs, and sacred traditions of the ancient Israelites. Leviticus explores a world where every action carried spiritual meaning, from food and cleanliness to worship and community responsibility. This book offers a window into ancient religion, culture, and the ideas that holiness touched every part of life. Welcome to Leviticus. Here we focus on burnt offerings, one of the oldest forms of sacrifice in the ancient world. Unlike other offerings where portions might be shared or eaten, the burnt offering was completely consumed by fire on the altar. It represented devotion, surrender, repentance, and a desire to draw near to God. The instructions were detailed and specific. A person could bring a bull from the herd, a sheep or goat from the flock, or even birds such as doves or pigeons. This allowed people of different wealth levels to participate. The offering had to be without defect, symbolizing purity and giving one's best. The person bringing the animal would place a hand upon it before sacrifice, creating a symbolic connection between the worshiper and the offering itself. The priests, descendants of Aaron, carried out the ritual at the altar. Blood was sprinkled, the animal prepared, and the sacrifice burned completely as smoke rose upward. The ancient Israelites believed this smoke represented an offering ascending to God, a sacred act of communication between humanity and the divine. This chapter sets the tone for the entire book of Leviticus. Holiness, order, ritual, and the belief that approaching God required preparation and reverence. It reminds us that worship in the ancient world was not casual. It involved sacrifice, intention, and a deep sense of sacred responsibility. Grain offerings did not involve blood sacrifice. Instead, they were gifts made from the fruits of human labor, fine flour, oil, and frankincense. These offerings reflected gratitude, provision, and dedication to God. The Israelites were instructed to bring finely ground flour mixed with oil, sometimes accompanied by incense. A portion would be burned on the altar by the priest, while the remaining part was often kept as food for the priesthood. This offering recognized that food itself was a blessing. Grain represented survival, harvest, and daily life. By giving back a portion, the people acknowledged that their sustenance came from God. Several specific instructions are given throughout the chapter. The grain offering could be presented in different forms: raw flour, baked bread, cakes, wafers, or grain cooked in a pan. This flexibility allowed people to offer what they had available while still participating in worship. Leaven, or yeast, was not to be included in offerings burned on the altar. In ancient symbolism, leaven often represented corruption or impurity because it caused fermentation and change. Salt, however, was required. Salt symbolized preservation, covenant, and permanence. It served as a reminder that the relationship between God and Israel was meant to endure. No honey was to be burned on the altar, likely because of its fermenting qualities and association with certain surrounding religious practices. This chapter shifts attention from sacrifice through death to sacrifice through provision. It reminds us that worship was not only about atonement, but also about gratitude, offering back a portion of what sustained life itself. The fellowship offering was shared. Part of the animal was offered to God, part was given to the priest, and part could be eaten by the person bringing the sacrifice and their family. This made the fellowship offering unique. It was not only about sacrifice, but about connection, a symbolic meal shared between people, priest, and God. The offering could come from cattle, sheep, or goats, but the animal had to be without defect. As in earlier sacrifices, the person presenting the offering placed a hand on the animal before it was sacrificed, marking a personal connection to the ritual. The priest would sprinkle the blood around the altar, while certain fatty portions were burned as an offering to God. Fat was considered the richest and best part of the animal, symbolizing giving the finest portion back to the divine. Specific parts were reserved for the altar, while the rest could become part of a sacred communal meal. This reflects how worship in the ancient world often involved feasting and shared celebration. This chapter also introduces an important instruction. The Israelites were not to eat blood or certain fat portions. Blood was viewed as the source of life and belonged to God alone. It highlights a different side of worship. While earlier sacrifices were focused on forgiveness or devotion, fellowship offerings emphasize gratitude, peace, celebration, and restored relationship. And it reminds us that worship was not always solemn sacrifice. Sometimes it was communal, celebratory, and centered around sharing a sacred meal, a moment of peace between humanity and the divine. If you are enjoying this Bible review, please hit the like and subscribe if you haven't already. It only takes a second and it's free. By doing so, you boost our ratings, and that helps us to do what we do. We appreciate it so much. Now, the focus shifts to sin offerings, sacrifices meant to address unintentional wrongdoing. Unlike deliberate rebellion, these were sins committed through ignorance, accident, or human error, reflecting on an ancient belief that even unintended actions could disturb the relationship between people, community, and the divine. The Lord gives Moses detailed instructions for different situations and different levels of responsibility. If a high priest sinned, the consequences were considered serious because his actions affected the entire community. A young bull was required as a sacrifice, and the ritual involved special treatment of the blood inside the sacred space. If the entire Israelite community committed a wrong, unknowingly, a similar offering was required. This shows how ancient Israel understood collective responsibility, that a community could share in both blessing and guilt. Leaders were given separate instructions. If a tribal leader sinned unintentionally, a male goat could be offered. For ordinary people, the offering varied depending on what they could afford, often involving a female goat or lamb. These distinctions revealed something important about ancient religious structure. Responsibility increased with authority. The greater a person's influence, the greater the expectation for spiritual accountability. Throughout the chapter, the act of placing a hand on the animal appears again. This symbolic gesture linked the individual to the sacrifice before it was offered. Blood played a central role in the ritual. In ancient Israelite belief, blood represented life itself and was treated as sacred. The priests would apply or sprinkle blood in specific ways to symbolize purification and restoration. This chapter also introduces an important idea that continues throughout Leviticus. Sin was not only personal, but communal and spiritual. Wrongdoing could create imbalance that required ritual correction. While modern readers may see these practices as unusual, they reveal how seriously ancient societies treated morality, responsibility, and sacred order. And it deepens the themes introduced earlier in the book. Holiness required awareness, accountability, and a structured way to restore harmony when mistakes were made. The Lord continues explaining different kinds of wrongdoing and how the Israelites were expected to respond when mistakes were made. Here God expands on the idea of sin introduced in the previous chapter, but now moves into situations involving guilt, accountability, and restitution. He begins by describing several examples of offenses which can make a person guilty. These include failing to speak up as a witness, touching something considered ceremonially unclean, or making careless promises or oaths without fully thinking through the consequences. These actions were not always intentional acts of rebellion. Often they involved neglect, forgetfulness, or lack of awareness. Yet, even these actions carried spiritual responsibility. When someone realized they had become guilty, they were expected to confess and bring an offering. The type of offering depended partly on what a person could afford. A lamb or goat could be offered, but for those with fewer resources, birds were acceptable. For the poorest individuals, even fine flour could be given. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout Leviticus. Worship was designed to be accessible regardless of social class or wealth. The chapter then shifts into instructions for guilt offerings. A guilt offering was different from a sin offering because it focused not only on wrongdoing, but also on repairing harm. If a person misused sacred property or acted dishonestly, compensation had to be made. In addition to bringing an offering, the guilty person was required to repay what had been lost or damaged, often adding an extra amount as restitution. This reveals an important principle in ancient Israel law. Forgiveness was not only spiritual, it also required making things right. The guilt offering recognized that actions have consequences. Restoration involved confession, sacrifice, and practical repair. Like earlier chapters, these laws may seem highly detailed to modern readers, but they reflect a society deeply concerned with order, fairness, and maintaining harmony within both community and worship. This chapter continues building one of Leviticus's central themes: accountability matters, and healing relationships often requires both acknowledgement and action. So far in the book of Leviticus, we've stepped into a very different kind of book. Unlike the action and storytelling found in the book of Exodus, Leviticus focuses on rules, rituals, and how the Israelites believed they should approach God. Chapters 1 through 5 introduce several different kinds of offerings. At first, these chapters can feel repetitive. Animals are sacrificed, priests perform rituals, and detailed instructions are repeated again and again. But in simple terms, these laws were creating structure. The Israelites had recently left slavery in Egypt and were becoming a new society. These rituals gave them rules, identity, and a shared understanding of right and wrong. Each offering served a different purpose. Some expressed devotion. Some showed gratitude. Others focused on forgiveness, repairing mistakes, and restoring balance after wrongdoing. The system also reflected everyday life. People were expected to take responsibility for their actions, whether intentional or accidental. In many ways, these early chapters of Leviticus are less about punishment and more about order, creating a system where people knew how to reconnect with God, community, and themselves after making mistakes. These rituals may seem distant or unusual, but they reveal how deeply ancient cultures tied religion to their daily lives. It reminds us that worship, morality, and community were all connected, and that even small actions were believed to carry spiritual meanings. Join us next week, and until then, keep praying, be kind, and keep the faith. Blessed be.